Hey everybody, and welcome to the first video for Chapter 18. That's going to be on the French Revolution and Napoleon. So we're going to be kind of running the spectrum from the beginning of the revolution through the different phases of it, and eventually ending with the empire and kingdom of Napoleon. You see Napoleon riding on his horse up there. So let's get into talking about the French Revolution. Very important period in European and world history, but it's also a pretty complicated one. You know, the ideas that came from the Enlightenment, like consent of the governed and natural rights, they led to several revolutions throughout the world, mostly in Europe, but a number in Americas as well. The first and most significant was the American Revolution that led to the United States. You'll learn about that next year. You know, we're really not going to get into that too much this year. The next major revolution that was inspired by the Enlightenment, though, was the French Revolution. It was founded on similar principles as the American Revolution, but, as you'll see, it was not nearly as successful in putting those principles into action and forming a new government. It was actually somewhat disastrous at different phases of it. So before we get into the revolution, let's discuss how it began. Okay, so Section 1, Beginnings of the Revolution. And before we, in order to understand the beginnings of the revolution, we have to understand the causes of the revolution. Now, understanding why and how the revolution began requires an understanding of what French society was like. Since medieval times, French society was divided into three estates, or social classes. Right? You've got the first estate, which was the church. So these are your bishops and your cardinals and your priests and so forth. The second estate was the nobles, all the really old school, wealthy, landowning families. And then you've got the third estate, which was predominantly made up of peasants who did all the backbreaking labor for all the rich people. But also was in the third estate was another group known as the bourgeoisie. Let me move me out of the way here so that you can fully get a look at this dude right there. The bourgeoisie were the middle class. They were bankers, they were merchants, lawyers, journalists, they were other educated professionals. Now you think, well, they don't sound like they should be in the same category as these guys over here. But because they weren't old school nobility, they were still looked down upon by the second, right? So you got one, you got two, and then both of these right here are three, right? So they got clumped in with it at the same time. All right, so the different social classes were broken up into strict groups. Additionally, there was a tremendous amount of, let me just erase all this stuff, wealth problems when it came to wealth distribution. You look at the chart. The black bar right there is percent of total population. So the first estate, barely anything, right? We're talking less than 1% of the overall population. Second estate, not much at all, maybe 2-3%. Third estate, almost everything. So the overwhelming majority of the population was made up by the third estate. But you look at the other ones, percent of total land owned. 10% of the total land owned in France was by the first estate. Almost 25% was by the second estate and everything else by the third. Now you could think, all right, well, the third estate still, owns more than the rest of them, but look at it proportionally in terms of their population. Less than 1% of the population owns 10% of the land. 2 to 3% of the population owns a quarter of the land. So when you look at it in that terms, it's really very, very unfair. All right. So you have what eventually happens here is you have this system where the third estate becomes very, very resentful of the first and second estate. And now to make matters worse, actually, one other thing I want to bring your attention to is you look at the taxes. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, but I just want to bring your attention now because I'm not going to show this chart again. First estate, 0. Church does not pay any taxes. Second estate, barely anything. Third estate, basically everything. Percent of income paid in taxes. So you have a very, very unfair distribution of taxes. Third estate has to shoulder almost the entire burden when it comes to taxes. All right, so financial problems. The national debt of France was through the roof at this time, and this was caused by a number of reasons. One was costly wars, such as the French-Indian War, the American Revolution. It worked out well for us, but France spent a ton of money on really trying to stick it to the British. They also regularly engaged in what we call deficit spending. Deficit spending is where the government continues to spend more money than it was taking in. Which is bad, obviously. You want to spend the money that you have. And lastly, you just had poor harvests, and that was just bad luck, basically. And this decreases the food supply. So what all of this amounted to was a nation that desperately needed money. And when a government needs money, the first thing it does is it increases taxes. But guess which group shouldered the disproportionate amount of the taxes? The third estate, as we saw from the chart before. So this gave rise a tremendous amount of unrest among the third estate. Okay, you had riots in the street, particularly for little things like bread. It also gave rise to this view that the first and the second estate, right? Here's one, here's two, here's three, that they were oppressing the third estate, that the third estate was basically, held into slavery of the first and second estate. So these two combinations are not going to work out too well for the upper class in France. Also, because of this desire and this strong call for reform, they said the only way to do that in France at the time was to call what's called the Estates General. Now, the Estates General was a legislative body, meaning it makes laws, and it was made up by representatives of all three estates, right? You got 1, 2, 3 right there. But you notice down here, one vote, one vote, one vote, all right? For the small numbers of the first and second, that's all well and good. But for the 97 or 98% of the population for the third estate, just to get one vote, that doesn't seem very fair. We'll come back to that in a minute. The Estates General also hadn't been called in 175 years. So obviously that shows, how drastic things had gotten and how serious things had gotten. But due to the growing problems, King Louis XVI, here's Louis with his tights, he was forced to call it. Now, Louis wasn't a bad guy. He wasn't a tyrant, but he was a weak and ineffective ruler, and therefore he wasn't respected by the people. However, he instructed the representatives from each estate to bring a list of grievances to the Estates General and basically just try and work something out. Soon after the meeting, though, the third estate quickly found out that it was going to be on the short end of the stick. Why? Because of what you see up here. All right, you've got 1 and 2 versus 3. Even though they make up such a large part of the population, they're always going to be outvoted by the first and second estates. So frustrated, the third estate decides, you know what, we're going to go off and do our own thing. And they took a very drastic step of breaking away from the Estates General and forming their own organization called the National Assembly. Now, the Assembly claimed to represent the true people of France, right? The true people down here. And after a few days of meetings, the National Assembly found themselves locked out of their meeting hall. So they moved to a nearby tennis court. It was here that the delegates took the famous tennis court oath. And it's literally what it sounds like. You see this picture of it here with everyone swearing this oath, this guy in the middle leading it. They swore to never disband and continue to work towards a new constitution for France. Eventually, you even had some reform-minded members of the first and second estates that decided to join in with these guys. And after that, this forced King Louis to really accept it as a legitimate group. Now, while all this was going on, even more drastic events were happening in Paris with the storming of the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was a medieval fortress. Right, medieval meaning Middle Ages. It was this big war fortress. And by this time in the late 1700s, it was being used as a prison for political prisoners, meaning people that spoke out against the king and the government. And because of this, it became a symbol of the upper class abuse, right? It represented the abuse of the upper class, and it was hated by the commoners of France. So on July 14th, 1789, and that's an important date because in France that's viewed as kind of being like their Independence Day, the way that in America it's July 4th, a crowd gathered outside the Bastille and demanded the weapons that they believed were stored inside. The commander in the Bastille refused to open it, and he ordered the guards to open fire. A fight eventually breaks out. A riot eventually breaks out. Then that resulted in the death of the commander and the guards. Now, a few prisoners were released. No weapons were found, though, so this really didn't accomplish all that much. But the storming of the Bastille was representative. It was a wake-up call for the upper classes of France. It told them that the people were angry and they were not going to be silent about it. All right, so that concludes on the opening phases of the revolution, and then we will get into the next phase where they really start to try and make some changes.